No one picks the time to be sick, but Tony picked a good time. The 1 Corinthians chapter 7 is I wouldn't say it's a difficult chapter, but there's a lot of things that's contained in it. Much of it is good common sense that can benefit us. There's a couple of things in the chapter that makes us ponder and think upon what is the proper understanding. And while I was in the class, I didn't mark exactly where we ended. I know that Tony read part of and perhaps all of the chapter. I know going through the questions, I remember answering and looking at some of them. I know he got through the true and false questions of chapter 6, and he got into chapter 7 questions. Does anyone else know specifically what question we stopped at? The first one. All right. Okay, good enough. Thank you, Melissa. That'll help. So if you have your little workbooks, I will read the question. We'll answer it and make some discussion. Then if we have time, I want to go back and look at some scriptures within this particular chapter. All right. Number 1, we'll go ahead and look at it briefly, and then we'll go on. Did Paul contend in this chapter that everything he mentioned was a direct command of God? And of course the answer is no. Verse 6, he said, "But I speak this by permission and not of commandments." Paul did right by the Holy Spirit, being directed by the Holy Spirit. But this is one unique chapter that he makes the statement. He says, "But I spake this by permission." He desired to give his opinion on the topic of marriage and some other things within this chapter, and he was granted that. So in the question, did Paul contend in this chapter that everything he mentioned was a direct commandment of God? And the answer is no. So he did, as I said, he was allowed of the Holy Spirit to give his opinion on some things. And I'm convinced that if it were not have been the case of truth, he wouldn't have been granted that permission. Okay? So that's a unique thing concerning the Scriptures, especially in this particular place. And if you have any questions about something, I may or may not know the answer, but by all means, speak up. Question number 2. What did Paul think of his own judgment? And it said, see verse 40. So let me turn and read verse 40. The statement is, "But she is happier if she so abide after my judgment. And I think also that I have the Spirit of God." Now what's the context here? When he is talking about this woman, he says, "But she is happier if she so abide." What's the context? Abide in what way? All right, in much of this chapter, Paul deals with the fact of widows, especially the latter part of this chapter. And he said if she desires to marry, or if a virgin desires to marry, so be it. Let them marry. It's better to marry than to burn. And the word concept of burn means to burn in desire. You can interpret that as physical lust, and I don't mean lust necessarily, but physical desire or passion, which there's nothing sinful about. Married couples can have such and should have such toward one another. But if she has that desire to marry, maybe she is madly in love or whatever, Paul was going to say it. Did Tony read the entire chapter last week? All right, do you remember where he stopped? Because just for me to go into these questions, if you haven't read the chapter, some of it's not going to make sense to you. But the point is, I'll continue this, and then we'll go back. When he says, "But she is happier if she so abide," Paul was saying because of the present distress, the difficulties that they were facing in the day, that it would be better for this widow or for a virgin not to marry. And he's going to give arguments. He gave certain arguments, concern of why that was the case, at least in his opinion. But that is the answer. So if we didn't read the whole chapter, and I don't believe he did either, when Melissa had talked to Connie or texted her and told her that Tony wouldn't be teaching, actually what I was doing last night when the nursing home called was studying, and then I was down there till up in the morning. So I haven't had all the time to go back and look where he did stop. But let's start reading at verse 6, because I don't remember Tony reading that far into the chapter. And I know it's somewhat of a lengthy chapter, but if we don't get this information, we're not going to understand these questions at all. Chapter 7, verse 6. He says, "But I speak this by permission, and not of commandment. For I would that all men were even as I myself." And I think if you'll read the context, he's talking about he was unmarried, okay? He was single. What's the meaning? "For I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner, and another after that." I interpret that, what he's saying is, I am single, but every man hath his proper gift. In other words, every man is different. Some men are not going to be single. They don't want to be single. They want to be married. And I think that's the idea. But in verse 8 he says, "I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I." So he is saying to the unmarried, and he's saying to the widows, you'd probably be better off to remain single. Now, I think in our adult class last week, I don't remember Michael making a comment, and I made one as well. That's not to say that living single is superior to being married. The Scriptures just don't teach that. Now, again, giving this present distress, we're giving a particular time period in history when Paul says, listen, it's probably better not to marry. Okay? Now, I say that that's not God's typical command, and especially when we get on down here, when he talked about how the person who is single can devote his or her time to God, whereas someone who's married, they give their attention to their wife or to their husband, and Paul is again advising, remain single, remain. If it's a widow, don't remarry. If it is someone who's a virgin or unmarried, don't marry. So let me continue this thought just for a moment, and I will go on. If it be the case that marriage is bad, why did God create it? Why did God create it? When he created Adam, he said, it is good for man not to be alone. Something was wrong. God created a helpmeet for them. God told Adam and Eve to go and to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. He told Noah and his wife the same thing after the flood. If there was a flaw concerning marriage that somehow it takes away from living the Christian life, why would God, in his wisdom, command that an elder be married and have children? Now we know why. For a man in his home, he has had the oversight of his home. He's reared his children. He's had to, guide them and nurture them along, and so forth. But we see the fact that there wouldn't be any elders if men didn't marry, right? What about deacons? Can you be a deacon without being married? Well, not according to the qualifications of 1 Timothy chapter 3. So we wouldn't have elders, we wouldn't have deacons. What about offspring within the church? No, wouldn't have offspring. So again, interpret this when Paul is talking about widows and the unmarried, it's because of the present distress. Verse 26, and I'm jumping ahead. "I suppose, therefore, that it is good for this present distress, I say, that it is good for a man so to be." And he's talking about so to be single is the idea. That's the context. But again, that's not always the case. And I am teaching Revelation on Sunday morning. We have talked numerous times in our short study how difficult times were, and that's the reason this book was being written. People were being literally put to death as Christians, martyred for the cause, and we can see the problems that would have brought families and so on when this happened. But I want to go back and think about something else and make the application before we go further. Have you ever had anyone say, couples shouldn't bring children into the world today? You ever heard that?
Yeah.
I don't believe it. I don't believe it's true. You know, again, I've given this a lot of thought since I knew I was going to teach the class. I'm sitting down at the emergency room. I think I left, I don't know, it was going to something, 1:30 or so in the morning. And I'm thinking, my mother was born July the 12th, 1940. She had been conceived after World War II had just started. Now, not here. Matter of fact, I think tomorrow is the anniversary of the time when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, okay? December the 7th. My point, in 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, England, and France almost within a very, very brief time, joined into the war. England, if you know, was pleading for the U.S. to get involved in the war. I mean, this wasn't something that the folks up on Heaton's Branch wouldn't have known anything about. Okay? What if my grandparents said, no, we can't bring a child into this world. No, we can't afford everything for them. No, our children will run around the summer barefooted. And they did. I mean, we're just barely making ends meet financially. While the whole world's getting ready to go into another world war. If that woman hadn't been born, all right, she had 3 sons, and this is kind of personal, but I'm hoping to make a point. She has 8 grandchildren. She has 14 great-grandchildren. Most of you know her. In other words, the kind of woman she lived. Was it better that she was never born? Would it have been better?
You wouldn't been here.
No, that's exactly right.
None
No.
of you would.
Do what?
None of you would be here.
That's exactly right. So, you know, and I think her sister's 2 or 3, Hazel's 2 or 3 years younger than her. So certainly she would have been conceived and born during the Second World War. But of any of those people who would have had the mindset, it's just not great. No, there's no way we ought to bring a child into this world. As I said, we can't even put shoes on their feet in the summertime. And look at the world, and the economy is only going to get worse now that we're soon to be drawn into another world war. But I hear people today talk about, you shouldn't bring a child into this world, and I'm just not going to do it, and look how bad it is. Well, I don't know about that. I disagree with that. Think about it.
I mean, they are bad things, but, you know.
But there has always been bad.
Always been.
Yes. Now, again, it may sound like I'm contradicting what Paul is teaching here. And, you know, all I can say is I wasn't there in the present distress. I haven't. Have any of us had people come and want to take our lives because we're Christians?
Not
Well, the answer
yet.
is no. And that may be, Judy. I don't know. Anyway, again, let me go on with this. Verse 8, I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it's better to marry than to burn. Now what does that verse mean? This is an adult class. If you can't control yourself, that's exactly what it means when it says if they cannot contain. If they cannot have self-control, I'll read it that way, let them marry. It's better to marry than to burn. What do you mean to burn? To burn in lust, to burn in desire. Fornication, coming from the Greek word porneia, simply means it's sex outside of marriage is sin. All right? Go back to the very first 2 verses Tony read last week. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it's verse 1. It is good for a man not to touch a woman. He isn't talking about touching her on the arm or holding her hand. The word touch, if you look that word up in the Greek, it can have various meanings. But according to Mr. Thayer, it also had to do with illicit sexual contact. They were asking Paul, is it wrong for a man to have sex with a woman outside of marriage? I mean, basically that's the meaning, what they ask him. Paul continued in verse 2, nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. God created man and woman with the ability to have sexual desires. I'm not going to stammer about that. That's just a fact. God created man and woman that way. And he goes on to talk about those particular things, and Tony read that last week about taking care of each other's sexual needs within marriage. That's verses 3 through 5. So, if they can't contain, they have those desires, they can't control those desires properly, Paul says let them marry. Nothing wrong with that. Better to marry than to burn. All right, he continues, verse 10. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. So we get that. Back in verse 6 he said, I speak this by permission, not of commandment. But now he says in verse 10, and unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord. Let not the wife depart from her husband. Now the church here, I think I certainly have taught, Tony's taught, others before me have taught God's plan for marriage. That when I say I do, I did. Romans chapter 7, verse 1 and 2, marriage is to last a lifetime. That's the way God intended it. That was his desire. God does Jesus gave one exception to that, and what is it?
Fornication.
All right. Here and I'll illustrate it with Connie and I. If I have what we call an affair, I go out and I have sex with some other woman or man, it would fall into that, then she would have the right, if she so chose, to divorce me, to put me away. According to Matthew 19:9, I have forfeited my right to marriage. She could, if she so chose, marry again. But here he says, unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. And it helps us to understand how we need to be very careful about the person we choose to marry. That should not be done without a great deal of thought and without knowing that person well. Because how many people have lived a life of misery, heartache, constant wrangling? And as one lady told me about her grandfather years ago, that he was always stirring up she's kind of a country lady, but he said, always stirring up a racket. Well, some people are like that. Always stirring up a racket, as we call it, or she did. We know what she meant. Always, fighting and feuding, never happy, the stress, the strife, how terrible. But yet, on the other hand, if we live as God has commanded us, as a husband, as a wife, what's the other side of that? What's the other possibility of that relationship? Yeah, peace at home, harmony, to be a helpmeet, someone to help you as you go throughout life, someone to share your life with. It's a beautiful thought in relationship when it's done the way God would have it to be. All right. But he goes on, verse 11. But, now verse 10, let the wife not depart from her husband. In other words, and that goes both ways. He says, verse 11, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So if Connie and we are married, and I simply say, I'm tired of you, whatever, and I walk away, I haven't been involved with any other woman or man, or I haven't committed fornication, does she have the right to remarry? The answer is no. No.
She'll still be married to you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's what Paul says. Let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. Why? Because we're still married. Okay, and that's exactly the case. That's what he teaches here. Now, we need to remember that because I've had conversations with some of my religious friends who are in denominational churches, and the place where they attend is filled with many, many people who are married for a lot of different reasons, and certainly not all of them are because of fornication. But they're going to go back down to verse 15 a little bit later and say, well, this is a different exception. All right, but regardless, we'll get there in a minute. Verse 12. But to the rest speak I, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. And the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. Let me stop and explain very simply. And don't you imagine that Paul had witnessed this time and again in his travels? Christianity, it relatively new. People have, they've left the Jewish system of things. They have now become Christians. They are learning this principle of the coming kingdom, that of what Christ taught. And I'm sure that Paul said, he saw people, okay, can you think of anyone in the New Testament whose mate was not a Christian? What about Timothy's mother? If you read in Acts chapter 16, I think it's Acts chapter 16, the first 2 or 3 verses there, you'll see that Timothy's mother was a Jew, and the Bible specifically says she was a believer, but her father was a Greek. And certainly it implies Timothy's father, was not a Christian. All right? Well, there's a conflict then, right? A Christian married to a non-Christian? Did Paul say, because you're married to a non-Christian, leave? Get away from that man in this case. No, of course not. All right? But he says, if she, in other words, stay together, verse 13, and the woman which hath an husband that believeth not, if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. Now that's a difficult passage in many respects. I'll give you my view. And Tony, Lord willing, will be well by next week. I would love to hear what he thinks of the passage. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Let me read something to you. You can turn if you like, or just listen to me read it. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? Now let me read that again. Think about marriage for a minute. Be ye not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. For what fellowship hath righteousness with unrighteousness? And what communion hath light with darkness? Now, if you read the context of 2 Corinthians chapter 6, he's not talking about marriage. But here's my thoughts of why Paul went into this. I believe he did encounter many people like Timothy. Mother was a Jew, a believer. Father was a Greek, a non-believer. And there were a lot of questions about, should they stay together? And Paul was saying, yeah. But now, let's use Timothy as an example. His mother a Jew, a believer. His father a Greek, unbeliever. What about if Timothy's father, the unbeliever, just left? Is Timothy's mother responsible for that? Can she help that? No, not at all. All right, and that's what he said earlier. If he departs, let him depart. You can't stop that. But if he doesn't, live with him. Now, in this verse, I believe that many people were looking at the fact, how can you, in other words, if you're a Christian, you've got to get out of that relationship. How can you be unequally yoked together with an unbeliever? And Paul says, no, that's not the case. Here, he goes on to say, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife. Does that mean he automatically is righteous with God? No, of course not. A marriage doesn't make someone holy, not in the sense that I mean as a Christian, okay? In other words, you're a Christian and you marry someone who's not a Christian, your marriage to that person doesn't make them a Christian. We all know that. But I think Paul is dealing with in the context of many people out here looking at this marriage, such as Timothy's mother and father, and saying, that's ungodly. And Paul says, no, it's not. No, it is not ungodly. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. And again, and I may be wrong on this. I don't know how else to interpret this, I'll be honest. But the fact is, if I can explain it, the fact that this couple is married, one is a child of God, one is not a child of God, Paul says that doesn't make, it's not as if you are leaving Christ, or my mind's not working too well without sleep here, as if you are not, what's the word I'm looking for?
Staying true to the gospel.
Yes. Okay. What is the word I want? I can't think of it, and I can't put it out here. Anyway, I'm not. If someone is a faithful child of God and all of a sudden they start taking drugs, you'd say, what about them? You wouldn't say anything. All right. What would you say?
They've fallen off the wagon.
Okay, they've fallen off the way. I'm looking for this word. I'm trying to get you to spit it out for me. I can't say it.
Well, just take my case. Lynn was a child of God. We were together years and years before she finally, I realized she is right, not wrong.
Right, that is true.
She helped me to see the truth.
And as far as your children, Paul says, your children, else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. And again, just the fact that Christian parents make holy children, holy in the sense, the word holy means, set apart, sanctified before God. No, of course not. But I have trouble with this verse, as you can obviously tell, and I'm not explaining it very well here. But I think that's all. I think other people were looking at this relationship saying, as I said, how can these two people, how can she compromise? Oh, why couldn't you say it for me? That she was compromising her faith. And Paul says, no, I don't think that's the case at all. So she's not compromising her faith just because her husband is an unbeliever, or wife, vice versa. But your children are holy. They're sanctified. In other words, it doesn't mean these children you bore are, again, as adult class, understand the context, as if they were bastards. In other words, you've had this child as if it was, someone who's not righteous at all. That's not the idea. He says they're holy. Scotty, you've held your hand up.
God wants us to build His kingdom. The man's not a Christian. The wife is. How would that look on Christians if she's like, you're not a Christian now. We're just going to divorce. Get on down the road. Because you're not a Christian. Because you don't believe. What does that say for Christianity?
That's true.
So that's what he said. He said, stay with it.
Yeah.
That's how we're going to build the kingdom, by bringing the children in too. They see mom and dad doing the same thing, going to church, being faithful, living right. Now we got something going.
Yeah, and what is it 1 Peter chapter 3, 1 through 3 teaches? You were going to bring that up? But in 1 Peter chapter 3, he talks about that the man may, by the behavior of the wife, be converted. Let me just turn and read this. It'll rambling through that. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1.
Who knows, he may come around to become a Christian.
Absolutely. Likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the behavior, and that's what the word conversation means in the King James, may be won by the behavior of the wives, while they behold your chaste behavior coupled with fear. So there's an example where Peter says, in other words, wife, fulfill your duties here, live as you ought as a Christian, and you'll have a great influence on your husband. All right, I'm sorry I butchered verse 14.
And you'd have family homes.
Do what?
Family homes.
Yes,
you
right.
know, with parents. And that's what's wrong with the world today. A lot of them.
A lot of it is.
Family homes.
Well, it kind of be like, how many times we'll sit around with non-Christians, we'll sit with Christians,
Yeah.
But y'all sit around constantly keep hanging around with these type of people.
Right.
You can't deal with it that way.
So anyway, in the context, I simply think verse 12 down through verse 15, Paul is saying, look, you're married, your spouse is an unbeliever, don't leave. You know, if they leave, you can't help it. But you don't leave. And as far as, are you compromising, that word I couldn't think of, are you compromising your faith by living with and being married to an unbeliever? Paul, I think, is saying no. And he was saying your children are holy. In other words, they're not as if, you know, that they're heathen, so to speak, simply because you were married to someone who is not a Christian. That's my view of the verse, if I may summarize it. Verse 15, but if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. Again, use Timothy's mother and father as an illustration. The father's not a Christian. If he decides, I'm not living with this woman, and he walks away, is that her fault? Well, it could be. But perhaps it's just because she is righteous, she won't do some of the things he demands or wants or whatever, and he can't live with her. Well, it's not her fault. Not every marriage ends because of the fault of both people. Now, often that may be the case, but not always. So Paul says here very clearly, if the unbelieving depart, let him depart. I mean, what are you going to do? You can't, you know.
You can't force it.
No. Let him depart. Now, it says that a sister is not under bondage in such cases. And I've had some of my friends who've divorced for any and every reason and cause, who want yet to follow the Scriptures, says, well, this passage says that person is not under bondage. Well, what was it Paul wrote back here in verse 10? And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. And then he goes on, but if she depart, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. So, again, if Timothy's father decides he's going to leave, there's nothing his mother can do about it. But does that give her the right then, or the privilege of saying that I can marry someone else? The answer is no. I mean, again, this passage is clear. She's not under bondage. She's not going to be held accountable for the fact she couldn't keep her husband from leaving. But she's still married. Okay? That didn't change that. Any thoughts or comments? Our time's almost up, but we can get another verse or two in. Verse 16. For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband? Or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? Well, we don't know. And, you know, I have counseled young couples who sometimes they were not Christian, or one was a Christian, the other one was not. And I was very clear to them to stop and to think and reflect. While you are head over heels in love with one another, will your differences take you down different roads later? In other words, as a Christian, this book is what is going to guide you and to be your mentor in the sense of telling you what's right and wrong. The person who's not a Christian, they don't have those values. They are not harnessed, they are not bridled by this book. In other words, they can do whatever they want. What about later? So it's very important the Bible does not command a person to marry a person who's a Christian. Boy, do you see the wisdom in it. And we could give so many examples why it would be best. Many are taught right here in this very chapter. All right. I apologize for, I guess, not being prepared as I should, and that's what led to some of the rambling, but thank you for participating and being involved in the class. And we didn't get very far, so if Tony's better, he can pick it up here however he wants, Melissa, and if not, I'll be happy to fill in if I'm able.